Jason Turner never used to like being outside as a kid, but once he got to college, that all changed completely. When he wasn't busy with classes or studying at the University of Michigan, Jason would head out to camp, hike, or fish. One of his favorite places to explore was the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. The rolling dunes, dense forests, and miles of untouched beach were the most perfect place in the world, to him. One especially warm summer weekend, Jason decided to head out to the dunes. The forecast was perfect, with the bonus of a full moon. He packed his gear into his pickup truck and made the drive from Ann Arbor to the park, arriving late in the afternoon. He planned to set up camp on the less crowded part of the park, away from the popular tourist trails. Jason parked his truck and grabbed his backpack. He took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the sand dunes. He hiked along a narrow trail that wound through the forest before opening up to the vast dunes. The sun had almost dipped below the horizon by the time Jason reached a secluded spot among the dunes. He set up his tent on a flat area, overlooking Lake Michigan. The view was breathtaking. The vast expanse of water stretched out in front of him, the waves gently lapping against the shore. As the last light faded, the moon rose, casting a silvery glow over the landscape. Jason built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. He sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the sounds of the night. After dinner, Jason pulled out a small flask of whiskey, taking a few sips as he relaxed. He leaned back against a log, staring up at the stars. The sky was clear, and the Milky Way stretched out above him, a river of light. He felt his eyelids growing heavy, the warmth of the fire and the gentle sound of the waves lulling him to sleep. Jason wasn't sure how long he had been asleep when he woke with a start. The fire had died down to embers, and the night was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, frogs, the breeze through the leaves, were absent. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess. Something had woken him, some sound or movement. He scanned the darkness, his eyes adjusting to the moonlight. Then he heard it, a low growl coming from the direction of the trees. The sound was deep, almost like a rumble. Jason froze. He listened, straining to hear anything else. There was another growl, closer this time, followed by the sound of something moving through the brush. Jason reached for his flashlight, fumbling with the switch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the sand and sparse vegetation around his camp. He scanned the area, his pulse quickening. At first, he saw nothing, just the shadows of the dunes and the moonlit beach. Then, at the edge of the light, he caught a glimpse of movement. A figure stood just beyond the circle of light, partially hidden by the tall grasses. It was tall, much taller than any person, and covered in dark fur. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he focused the flashlight beam on it. The figure stepped forward, coming into full view. Jason's mind reeled at what he saw. The creature stood upright, like a man, but its body was covered in shaggy dark fur. Its arms were long, ending in hands that resembled claws. The head was wolf-like, with pointed ears and a long snout, its eyes glowing with a strange amber light. The creature's mouth was slightly open, revealing sharp teeth. Jason tried to comprehend what he was seeing. He had heard stories about the Michigan Dogman, a legendary creature rumored to roam the woods and fields of the state. But he had always dismissed them as just that, stories, urban legends and campfire tales. Yet here it was, standing before him. The creature let out another low growl, its eyes locked onto Jason. He felt a wave of fear wash over him, paralyzing him. The creature's eyes seemed to glow brighter, filled with a strange intelligence. It took a step closer, its claws sinking into the sand, moving with a strange, fluid grace. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if studying him, its ears twitching. Jason slowly reached for a piece of driftwood by the fire, his hand trembling. He didn't know what he could do against a creature like this, but he needed something to defend himself. As his fingers closed around the wood, the creature suddenly snarled, baring its teeth. It took another step forward, and Jason's fear reached a breaking point. He jumped to his feet, brandishing the piece of wood like a club. The movement seemed to surprise the creature. It hesitated, its ears flattening against its head. "Get back!" Jason shouted, his voice shaking. "Stay away!" For a moment, the creature seemed to consider him. Then, with a final growl, it turned and loped away, disappearing into the darkness. Jason stood there, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The piece of driftwood clutched tightly in his hand. He listened to the sound of the creature's footsteps fading into the night, followed by silence. Jason didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat by his dying fire, his eyes scanning the shadows, everything making him jump. The image of the creature, its glowing eyes and wolf-like face, was burned into his mind. He kept the flashlight on, shining it into the darkness every few minutes, his nerves on edge. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, Jason packed up his gear and headed back to his truck. His hands were still shaking as he loaded his backpack, constantly glancing over his shoulder. The forest was waking up around him, the birds beginning to sing, but he felt no comfort. He needed to get away. When he finally reached his truck, Jason threw his gear into the back and jumped into the driver's seat. He started the engine, the familiar sound bringing a small sense of relief. He drove away, speeding down the dirt road, heading for the nearest town. Back in the safety of his apartment in Ann Arbor, Jason tried to make sense of what had happened. He spent hours researching, reading everything he could find about the Dogman. There were stories dating back to the 1800s, tales of a half-man, half-dog creature that roamed the forests and fields of Michigan. He debated telling someone about his encounter, but decided against it. He didn't have any proof, just his own terrified memory. He considered going back to the dunes, but the thought of encountering the Dogman again made his blood run cold. Every time he went hiking or camping, he found himself looking over his shoulder, listening for the sound of footsteps in the dark. The peace he once found in the wilderness was gone, replaced by a sense of unease. Jason knew one thing for sure. Michigan was home to more than just natural beauty. There were things out there, creatures that defied explanation, and he had seen one of them with his own eyes. I've been a trucker for the better part of 20 years, and I've seen just about everything you can imagine out on the open road. Weird weather, strange accidents, and people doing downright crazy things. It all comes with the territory. But there was one night a few years back that still makes me squirm in my seat every time I think about it. I've never seen a ghost, and I don't really believe in them. But what I saw that night was something I can't explain. Something that doesn't fit into the world as we know it. It was a late fall evening, and I was driving through Nevada, heading east on a long stretch of I-80. It's one of those highways that cuts through the middle of nowhere. Nothing but desert and scrubland as far as the eye can see. Most nights, the road is pretty empty, especially that time of year, with just a few trucks and the occasional car passing by. The stars were out in full, and the moon was bright enough that I didn't need my high beams to see where I was going. I'd been driving for hours, and it was getting close to midnight when I decided to pull over at a rest stop to stretch my legs and grab a cup of coffee from my mug. The rest stop was one of those bare-bones spots with just a couple of picnic tables and a bathroom, the kind you find all over the desert. There wasn't another soul in sight, which wasn't unusual for that stretch of road, so I figured I'd be alone for the rest of my break. After a few minutes of standing around, sipping my coffee and looking up at the stars, I heard something strange, a rustling noise coming from the brush off to the side of the rest area. At first, I thought it might be a coyote or maybe a jackrabbit, common enough out there, so I didn't pay it much mind. But the rustling grew louder, more deliberate, like something big was moving through the scrub, and that's when I started to feel uneasy. I grabbed my big black flashlight from the cab of my truck and shined it toward the noise, but I couldn't see anything at first, just the usual sagebrush and rocks. The sound stopped, and everything went quiet again, too quiet. I was about to head back to the truck when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I swung the flashlight in that direction, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a person, but the longer I looked, the more I realized it wasn't. The creature was hunched over, partially hidden by the brush, but I could see enough to know it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. It was tall, even in its crouched position, with long, spindly limbs that ended in what looked like claws. Its skin was rough and scaly, like that of a lizard, and it had a tail that flicked back and forth behind it. The thing that still wakes me up at night was its eyes. They were large, almost too large for its head, and they glowed faintly in the light from my flashlight, reflecting it back at me like a cat's eyes would. But these eyes were horrendous. They were cold, calculating, almost intelligent. They locked onto me, and I felt an icy breeze that had nothing to do with the cool night air. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched me intently. This wasn't some desert animal. It wasn't a coyote or a mountain lion. This was something that didn't belong out there, or anywhere else for that matter. Finally, the creature moved. It didn't run away like I half expected it to. Instead, it stood up to its full height, towering over the brush. It was even taller than I'd realized, easily over 7 feet, and its body was long and lean, almost serpentine. It took a step toward me, and I instinctively backed up, nearly tripping over my own feet in the process. That's when it let out a sound, a low, hissing growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath me. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted for the truck, not bothering to look back. I scrambled into the cab, slammed the door shut, and locked it, as if that would do any good. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to start the engine, and when I finally got it going, I peeled out of that rest stop faster than I've ever driven before or since. As I sped down the highway, my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirrors, half expecting to see that thing chasing after me. But the road behind me was empty, just the same dark highway stretching out into the night. I didn't slow down until I reached the next town, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pulled into a truck stop, parked under the bright lights, and sat there for a long time, just trying to calm down. I knew I wasn't dreaming, and I hadn't imagined it. That thing was real as the truck I was sitting in and thinking about it. I've never told anyone about that night, not the full story anyway. I've mentioned seeing strange things out on the road, but I always keep the details vague. People would think I'm crazy, or worse, they'd want to go out there and look for it themselves. And trust me, you don't want to find it. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't meant to be found. It's one of those things that's better left alone, out there in the darkness where it belongs. Because whatever that creature was, I hope I never see it again. Because if I do, I'm not sure I'll be as lucky a second time. Private First Class Adam Reynolds wasn't new to the wilderness. Growing up in rural Michigan, he'd spent his fair share of nights camping, fishing, and hunting in the state's sprawling forests. But this wasn't a leisurely weekend camping trip. This time, he was on a training exercise with his unit at Camp Grayling. Camp Grayling is the main training facility for the Michigan National Guard and the largest U.S. National Guard training facility in the country. Stretching across more than 147,000 acres, Camp Grayling's dense woods and rugged terrain provided an ideal setting for military exercises, simulating the conditions soldiers might face in actual combat. Adam's unit had been at Camp Grayling for nearly a week, running through various drills and exercises. The days were long and demanding, filled with tactical training, weapons practice, and endurance marches. By the time evening rolled around, most of the soldiers were too exhausted to do anything but eat and crash out in their tents. Adam usually fell asleep the moment his head hit the pillow, but tonight was different. It was past midnight, and the forest around him was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Adam lay in his tent, staring up at the canvas ceiling, unable to sleep. The unease had been growing since sunset, a strange, unsettling feeling he couldn't quite shake. He told himself it was just fatigue from the intense training schedule, but he'd been in the Army long enough to know to trust his gut. And right now, his gut was telling him something wasn't right. He finally gave up on trying to sleep, deciding to take a walk to clear his head. Maybe a little fresh air would help. Adam slipped on his boots and grabbed his flashlight and rifle, standard procedure even during training exercises. He unzipped the tent as quietly as he could, not wanting to wake anyone else. The cool night air hit his face, and he took a deep breath, stepping out into the darkness. The camp was quiet, the only light coming from a few dying embers in the fire pit, and the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. Adam walked past the rows of tents, heading toward the perimeter of the camp. He wasn't sure where he was going, just that he needed to move, to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at him all evening. He followed a narrow trail that led away from the camp, into the deeper part of the forest. The trees here were tall and old, their branches arching overhead to form a thick canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. The air was cooler, and the sounds of the camp faded away, replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Adam walked for a while, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam of light through the darkness. He felt his nerves beginning to settle, the familiar comfort of the forest easing his mind. He stopped for a moment, taking in the night sounds. That's when he heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes off to his right. He turned, shining his flashlight in the direction of the sound. At first, he saw nothing but shadows and leaves. Then, a shape moved at the edge of the light, something large and dark. Adam tensed, his hand tightening on his rifle. He pointed the flashlight, trying to get a better look. For a moment, the shape was still, blending into the darkness. Then it moved again, stepping into the light. Adam's breath caught in his throat. Standing at the edge of the trees was a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. It was tall, easily 7 feet or more, with a muscular build. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its eyes glowed with an eerie yellow light. The creature's head was canine, like a wolf or a dog, but it stood upright on 2 legs, its posture more human than animal. The creature stared at him, its eyes reflecting the beam of the flashlight. For a moment, neither of them moved. Adam's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He'd heard stories from some of the older guys in his unit about strange sightings in the woods around Camp Grayling, tales of creatures and cryptids that roamed the forests at night. But he'd always brushed them off as just stories, the kind of things soldiers made up to pass the time. Now, standing here with this creature just a few yards away, he wasn't so sure. Adam slowly raised his rifle, his heart pounding. The creature's eyes flicked to the rifle, and it let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate in Adam's chest. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, his body tensing with a primal fear. The creature bared its teeth, revealing long, sharp fangs. "Easy," Adam whispered, his voice shaking. He didn't know if the creature could understand him, but he hoped his tone would convey that he wasn't looking for a fight. "I don't want to hurt you." The creature took a step forward, its eyes never leaving Adam. He felt a wave of fear wash over him, his instincts screaming at him to run. But he held his ground, his finger resting on the trigger of his rifle. He knew that if this thing decided to attack, he might only get one shot. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the creature turned and bolted into the forest, moving with a speed and agility that was almost supernatural. Adam stood frozen, listening to the sound of its footsteps fading into the distance. The forest was silent again, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Adam lowered his rifle, his hands shaking. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He replayed the encounter in his mind, trying to make sense of what he had seen. The creature was real. There was no denying that. He had seen it with his own eyes. But what was it? Some kind of animal that had been misidentified. A prank by one of the guys in his unit. But no, he knew that wasn't it. There was something about the creature, something intelligent and aware. This was no ordinary animal. He slowly made his way back to camp, his mind still reeling. As he approached the tents, he saw a couple of his fellow soldiers sitting by the fire, talking in low voices. They looked up as he approached, noticing the look on his face. "You okay, Reynolds?" one of them asked, a hint of concern in his voice. Adam hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just..." "Thought I saw something out there," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. He didn't want to sound like he was losing it. "Probably just a bear or something." The soldiers exchanged a look, then one of them shrugged. "Yeah, lots of weird stuff in these woods," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "You hear all kinds of stories. Wouldn't be the first time someone saw something strange out there." Adam nodded, not saying anything. He didn't mention the creature, didn't tell them about the glowing eyes or the way it had stood on two legs. He wasn't sure why, but something told him to keep it to himself. Maybe he didn't want to be the subject of the camp's rumors, or maybe he just needed time to process what he had seen. He lay awake in his tent for the rest of the night. The image of the creature's glowing eyes burned into his mind. He knew he wouldn't forget it anytime soon. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, Adam made a decision. He would keep his eyes open, stay alert during his time at Camp Grayling. He wanted to believe it was just a one-time encounter, a fluke. But deep down, he knew that the creature was still out there, roaming the forests of northern Michigan. And as long as it was, Adam would be watching.